We will be continuing with Chapter 17 of Burying the Boys, The CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History by Daniel Hopsicker. Sinners in Heaven. With Jack Kennedy reduced to a flickering flame over a gravesite in Arlington National Cemetery, the boys were firmly in the saddle and ready to pursue their dreams that section of the planet known as Southeast Asia. They moved to Laos because that was where the money was. A man who spent over 20 years in special forces, who we'll call Colonel Nick, told us. He'd been stationed in Laos in the mid-60s, he said, in charge of an A base in the hills. His job had been to pay hill tribesmen $6 per kilo for the opium. The Chinese only paid $4, and that was how we bought their allegiance. This special ops vet told us, and once a month we would pile all of the acquired opium down on the end of the dirt runway and burn it in a bonfire. Then, as I recall, some of the guys would run around quick to get downwind. There's not that much to do in Laos. Everything changed in early 1965, Colonel Nick said. Then an order came down to burn no more opium, but to store it, instead for removal to a more secure location. That order coincided with Ted Shackley, Oliver North, and Richie Secord coming into the theater of operations, he stated crisply. Soon the planes from Air America started landing in Laos much more frequently, then lumbering toward Saigon filled with opium, where their cargoes created thousands of GI addicts who brought their habits home with them. This is such an open secret that they even made a movie about it. Air America, starring Mel Gibson. What they don't tell you in the movie, said Nick, is about the number of Air America planes that were subsequently brought down by friendly fire, by grunts on the ground who knew how dirty the war had become. Do you want to know why the Vietnam War lasted so long, he asked. Because too many people were making too much money. During a time when the official story of Barry Seal's career had him flying for TWA, numerous sources stated that they were spotting him in Southeast Asia. Barry Seal did a lot of damn good stuff in the late 60s, CIA pilot Tosh Plumley told us. In 67 and 68, he was with Air America in South Vietnam and Laos doing search and destroy and special ops with Ted Shackley's boys. He'd been recruited for special ops because of the Cuban thing. Was Seal's job at TWA just his cover? Several military intelligence veterans said yes, including one who told us he had first encountered Seal while flying in and out of Burma's Golden Triangle, tracing international flows of money for military intelligence. Barry and I were both in Southeast Asia during the same time frame, one stated. I began seeing his name on cables in early 1964. In retrospect, after spending years trying to piece everything together, what I think was going on was half of us was chasing the other half, but we were all reporting to the same people. In 1968, I was in San Francisco, and then he had become a 747 captain flying internationally, said one of Barry Seal's closest lifelong friends, Joe Hurston. I know that Barry was in Special Forces at the same time and that he made some extraordinary flights while working for TWA over the Orient. I worked for Barry Seal all during those years, Joe continued. I ran several businesses for him, Seal Sky Service, Aerial Advertising, Seals Texaco, and I would be the one to pick him up at New Orleans International Airport when he'd return from overseas. What did he tell you he was doing, we asked. Very often he would just shake his head and say, Man, if you only knew what I've just been. Man, if only you knew where I've just been. What's that? What that it? Was that it? Okay. Once or twice he said a little more, One time he told about having flown a 707 into Southeast Asia, landing on an isolated runway somewhere, and taxiing underground. What do you mean he taxied underground? Hurston shrugged. That's what he said. I'm just telling you what he told me. Later, we checked with a former Special Forces operative who had done 3 tours in the area. There was an underground facility, a huge one, he told us. It was in Thailand at a place called Nakhon Phantom near Udon. We discovered a document in Barry's own handwriting which shed a little light on what he had been doing. In a note to his attorney coaching him on what to say during a pleading for dismissal in his 1972 explosives bust, covered in the next chapter, he wrote, "Don't forget that while in the employ of TWA, I volunteered for hazardous duty without extra compensation to fly TWA's contract U.S. military flights into hot war zones into Vietnam, which I did with tons of explosives and war material. Youngest captain for TWA on a Boeing 707 too. CIA electronics expert Ed Homer CIA electronics expert Homer Red Hall gave another inkling of what SEAL had been doing. I first met Barry probably in the middle 50s. I was a pilot too, working with Hare Flying Service, which is where Barry worked. They sold airplanes and had a maintenance hangar, and that's where everybody was hanging out. And that's where everybody was hanging out, there and the downtown airport. Then I went into the Navy. When I came out of the service, I'd seen him around. We didn't actually chum together, but you were around in the hangar, you get friendly. We're both pilots, slapping each other on the back and all that. We were all very young. What is the significance of Barry Seals having been involved in the secret war in Laos? The secret war in Laos, we discovered, had an Alice in Wonderland quality. Certainly the pilots didn't understand it. Could it have been a war fought over drugs? It was all not quite real, one Air America vet recalled in the book Air America, from which the movie was made. Our wives would run across communist Pathet Lao soldiers in the marketplace in Vientiane doing their shopping. Crazy. In the early 60s, American pilots were even housed in the same hotel in the Laotian capital that the enemy Soviet pilots used. Every morning, the Americans would fly out in their C-46s and C-47s to drop supplies to rightist troops, while the Russians would take off in Illyhusen transport planes to drop supplies to the Pathet Laos. I watched T-28s loading up with bombs while 2 Russian 144 taxied across the runway. Air America pilot Wayne Lannon said, the T-28s took off on bombing runs, and Russians took off for Hanoi, and we took off to do our thing. It was all very strange. At night, all the pilots drank Pernod together in the hotel bar, swapping war stories. Former Newsweek reporter John Rabaton concurred. The whole thing was ridiculous. There were these 3 half-brothers, and one was in charge of the government, one was in charge of Pathet Lao, and the third was the king, politically neutral. Crazy. But according to experts like Professor Alfred McCoy, it had a very rational purpose: opium. The enterprise in which Barry Seal took part in Southeast Asia is replete with names we are becoming familiar with, from Shackley's Miami team that was moved en masse to Laos, bringing at least 3 of his Operation 40 assassins to Laos with him: Felix Rodriguez, Jose Posada, and Chichi Quintero. But the 60s weren't the start of the CIA dealing drugs. Before there was a CIA, there had been the OSS. The heroin that the OSS deal was grown in Burma and refined in Shanghai. They stumbled upon they stumbled upon this import when they were in Asia with the Flying Tigers. To stop Mao from assuming power, the poppy to ghetto connection actually began in World War II with Colonel Paul Helliwell of the OSS, who brought heroin from Burma to the US as far back as the mid 1940s. You have to understand the mentality that these guys developed during and after the Second World War. CIA pilot Gary Etiel told us it was, let's root out communism, and while we're at it, steal all the gold and art. We will hear evidence that Paul Helliwell is linked to the ownership of Barry's fleet of drug smuggling aircraft during Barry's 80s heyday. Drugs produce untraceable cash for the things covert ops love best: mercenaries, fixing elections, and buying politicians. Strapped for cash in the early 1950s, the French Secret Services used Corsican opium dealers throughout the Indochina to finance their operations against Viet Minh. They set up a system for the collection and distribution of opium and morphine base from all over the Golden Triangle of Laos, Burma, and Thailand. Morphine base is easily manufactured in makeshift jungle labs. Opium's major alkaloid is precipitated out of the raw sap by boiling it in water with lime. The white morphine floats to the top, is drawn off and boiled with ammonia, filtered, boiled again, and then sun-dried. The resultant clay-like brown paste is morphine base. That's where the Corsicans came in, refining the morphine into heroin, preferred by addicts because it is quicker acting and more potent than unrefined morphine. When the French decamped, the CIA was only too willing and eager to inherit this network. Could this have been behind Eisenhower's proscription against the boys running amok in Vietnam in 1954? History shows that the CIA disregarded President Eisenhower's order. CIA Colonel Ed Lansdale was the lead unconventional warfare officer attached to the Saigon military mission. His 12-man team was in place less than 2 months after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu, they found that well-organized Bin Xuyen Street gang directly controlled Saigon's police force. Lansdale used American money to buy the defeated French-Vietnamese army, the ARVN, and he used it in a savage 6-day battle to take Saigon back from the Binh Xuyen that left 500 dead. He worked in tandem with the Lucien Conan, about whom we still hear more later in our story. During World War II, Conan had led OSS paramilitary operations in North Vietnam, fighting in the Tonkin jungles with French guerrillas. His intimate knowledge of French forces and his skillful use of troops helped Lansdale take Saigon. Later, when opium warlord Vang Pao went to war with 2 rival drug lords for control of the Southeast Asian opium trade, he met first with CIA Station Chief Ted Shackley. Vang Pao wanted total control of the opium trade, while Shackley was looking for a military intelligence foothold in the trade. The two struck a bargain, and U.S. Air Force jets then bombed the compounds of both of his rivals out of existence. The young major who coordinated the bombing attacks on Vang Pao's rivals was Richard Secord. When Vang Pao became undisputed lord of the Southeast Asian opium trade, he donated a share of his profits to the training and equipping of Laotian tribesmen for incursions against North Vietnamese supply lines and to carry out assassinations against suspected communist sympathizers. Drugs were, once again, paying for assassinations, while Secord coordinated the flights that ferried arms, personnel, and heroin to various points in Europe and Asia. John Singlab ran the assassination arm of the enterprise. One of the pilots who made these flights was a Special Forces lieutenant named Alder Berryman, aka Barry Seal, who will in the 1980s fly a fleet of drug smuggling aircraft, many of them procured for him by Singlaub. Mafia Don Santos Traficante visited Vang Pao in a Saigon hotel, and walked away the leading importer of China white heroin in the world. Vang Pao's profits soared. So did his contributions to the training and equipping of the Laotian tribesmen. What had been a relatively small-scale operation blossomed into the Phoenix Project, an epic intelligence debacle that resulted in a bloodbath. The assassination of nearly 40,000 non-combatants in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. The boys had established an important precedent, using an existing criminal infrastructure to finance intelligence community operations that never would have received funding through standard operation channels. Subverting the will of Congress and the American people would now be easy. Long after Shackley returned to the U.S. to run the Western Hemisphere operations of the CIA, his agents were raking in millions of dollars from Vang Pao and transferring it to a bank in Australia called the Nguyen Hand Bank. Nguyen Hand. Yeah, I read a book on that. They also began to pilfer tons of military equipment from depots around Asia and transfer it to a secret base in Thailand. The operation became public knowledge in the late 1970s when Bo Gritz and Ross Perot drummed up support for bringing home the remaining American POWs. Gritz, the most decorated Green Beret commander of the Vietnam era, was asked to surreptitiously enter Laos looking for Americans. Gritz ended up meeting the recognized overlord of heroin in the world, Kun Sa. On a Gritz-produced videotape, Kun Sa said that U.S. government officials had been and are now his biggest customers, and had been for the 20 years. We fought in a war in Laos and Cambodia, even as we fought whatever it was in Vietnam. There are as many bomb holes in those two countries as there are in Vietnam. 550 plus Americans were lost in Laos. Not one of them ever came home. Yet we heard a president say, "The war is over. We are out with honor. All of the prisoners are home." Gritz's remarks made at a crowded news conference in which he implicated top U.S. officials in the drug trade were uniformly ignored in the major media and covered only by the Spotlight in Washington, D.C., the only national newspaper to consistently report on this too sensitive topic. "We ran the war in Laos and Cambodia through drugs," Gritz continued, "from 65 to 75. There is one CIA guy in Laos named Shackley involved in the narcotics business. And you know who he used for distribution? Santos Traficante. Old friend of the CIA and mob boss. Later, Richard Armitage, who stayed in Asia after the Vietnam War ended, was a prominent trafficker in Bangkok between 1975 to 1979. He was one of the embassy employees. Armitage was also responsible for recovery of U.S. prisoners of war. Richard Armitage later joined Bob Dole's staff, then Reagan's campaign staff, and ended up the Assistant Secretary of Defense. Grit says Ross Perot had reports on Armitage, and he ended up pinning Richard Armitage, a giant of a man, up against a wall, demanding that Armitage resign. Perot accused him of being a drug smuggler and an arms dealer. That takes pretty big cojones, and that's why he never became president. He was too witted. Perot then went to his friend George Bush and gave him evidence of wrongdoing by Armitage, and Bush told Perot to go to the proper authorities. So he called on William Webster later, head of the CIA, and made at least one visit to the White House carrying a pile of documents. He received no support from the Reagan administration. In fact, Carlucci, the Secretary of Defense before he was Deputy Director of the CIA, called him in to ask him to stop pursuing Armitage. Clearly, then spooks dealing drugs isn't an aberration of the 1980s. They flew heroin in Asia on the CIA proprietary airline Air America during the Vietnam War, where it was refined in Asian soft drink bottle factories owned by PepsiCo. Later, we will support a Contra army led by Adolfo Calero, whose involvement in narcotics trafficking is notorious, and who also owned the Nicaraguan soft drink concessions for Coke. Jack Ruby, it has even been suggested, might have been recruited into the Burmese heroin business while still a soldier during World War II. Then the main smuggling trail for opium to the west was from Burma overland to Turkey, then by various routes to the Marseilles. But during World War II, this route was disrupted, and other routes took up the slack, the main one being from China and Burma on U.S. military ships around South Africa and ending in Florida, which had the main supply ports for the China-Burma-India theater. Ruby had been sent to the Republic Aircraft Factory in Farmingdale on Long Island, where Army Air Corps Intelligence was developing the first two prototypes of a photo reconnaissance aircraft being tested at that time for use in the Pacific Theater. He received specialized reconnaissance aircraft mechanics training before moving to the Chatham Air Base near Savannah, Georgia. Chatham. Irving Zakharin, one of Ruby's fellow soldiers, remembers that Chatham was a secret logistics base to reconnaissance units in Asia. Could this have been where Ruby became involved in OSS officer Paul Helliwell's smuggling? While this is still secret history, its outlines are dimly visible. We already know that by 1947, Ruby was involved with the major international heroin operation in North America, and Farmingdale on Long Island is a place Barry Seal, like Jack Ruby a generation before, will spend a lot of time during the 1960s even teaching brother-in-law and future smuggling pilot Bill Bottoms to fly there. But who is the wizard pulling the strings behind the velvet curtain? One likely candidate might be CIA agent Paul Helliwell, who somehow managed to toil in anonymity in the cocaine-filled 1980s when he was the true owner of drug smuggler Barry Seal's Learjet. A new generation had taken control. We were all about to experience the consequences. And we're still experiencing them to this very day. That's it for today.